Continuing with notes here of Unit 9, this is Part 2. We know that companies are getting rather large at this time. And as you can see on the board here, I have two terms, robber barons or captains of industry. These are two terms that basically are different ways to define the same thing. Really big businessmen or big businesses. You can either think they're bad, which is a robber baron. A robber baron is someone that just cares about money and greed and doesn't necessarily break the law to do that, but does some things that a lot of people would find morally questionable, some shady deals, that kind of stuff. Or you can think of them as the corporations or people that ran them as captains of industry. These are just smart businessmen. They're savvy people that you know, just made good business deals. So it's the positive version of this. But either one of these are just different ways to talk about big businessmen of the time. Okay? A common example usually given for as a robber baron is Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Standard Oil is the company that he formed, and eventually he forms a monopoly in oil and controls about 90% of the oil. And he wasn't too picky about how he got to that monopoly. He drove a lot of people out of business because he would raise prices in one area to cover the lowering of prices in another one, where he would kind of drive people out of business. That's why a lot of people nicknamed him Rockefeller. Ida Tarbell is someone that wrote a lot of essays about Rockefeller and how his company was bad for America and destroying kind of the small guy, the small businessman, who is often credited as being kind of the backbone of our country. A guy on the flip side that's usually considered a captain of industry is a guy named Andrew Carnegie, who formed a monopoly in U.S. Steel. Carnegie is an immigrant. He's a typical rags to riches kind of story. He comes, I think, if I remember correctly, like $15 in his pocket, and he works hard and he pays attention and he educates himself and he makes large investments, or very good investments that make him largely successful and wealthy. And some people classify him as the time later as the richest man in the world. He becomes very, very wealthy, super rich. And so he's often considered a captain of industry because he did it more through hard work and diligence, where Rockefeller did some stuff that's a little shady. You could find plenty of examples of either way, of either one, but again, basically what they're talking about is the idea that these big corporations are bad, they're robber barons. If you think the big corporations are good, they're captains of industry. Okay? Carnegie, later on, as he gets really wealthy, writes a book, and it's called The Gospel of Wealth, where basically he advocates that wealthy people have to take care of society a little bit. They have to give back to their community. They have to share some of their wealth. They have to try to make the world a better place. That's part of the responsibility of being wealthy and powerful. You have to do those sorts of things, and that becomes a popular idea at the time. And that's why he's often considered a captain of industry, because he has some ideas like that. And he's what's called a philanthropist. A philanthropist is someone that gives money to charity. And he gave lots of money to charity. In fact, what Carnegie did impacts people even to this day, because he donated a lot of money to public libraries. He thought if people would have a library, then they too could improve themselves like he did. They could go to the library and study and learn a trade or study a topic and use that to better themselves. So he gave lots and lots of money to public libraries all over the country. In fact, if you go to our public library, you will see a portrait of Andrew Carnegie there, due to the fact that he gave money to start it. And that's all over North Dakota, all over the country. This idea of the social gospel is closely connected to the gospel of wealth. It's a reform movement because there was a huge gap growing again between the rich and the poor. That gap was getting wider. So there was a movement by a lot of ministers that said Christians have a duty to try to help the poor and help reform society as well. And again, those ideas are kind of connected, because that's sort of what Carnegie was saying. He was saying the rich have the duty to kind of help society, where the social gospel is just any Christian has the duty. But they both saw that there was kind of a problem with it, and that some things needed to be done to improve it. So they're kind of linked. On the other hand, on the flip side, you'd have the social Darwinists who kind of were the opposite. These were people that said it's natural to have rich and poor, so don't worry about it. You can't ever eliminate the poor. And it was used to kind of justify the wealth that people had at this time, because these big businesses were generating huge amounts of money. And some of these guys had so much money they had no idea what to do with it. So they would light their cigars with $100 bills and build these huge mansions and things such as this to kind of show how wealthy they were and how much money they had. And the social Darwinists took Darwin's theory of evolution and survival of the fittest and applied it to society and said, you know, the guys at the top are there for their genetics. They're genetically superior. They're rich. They're powerful. They're wealthy for a reason. They have smarter brains. They have a better work ethic, and those are genetic traits. And they said the people at the bottom are at the bottom for the opposite reason. They have poor genes, poor genetics that cause them to be lazy and not as driven, and they're not as intelligent, which is why they're on the bottom. But that's okay, because that's just how God intended it to be. It's just how nature works. You have people at the top and you have people at the bottom. So these are all kind of different theories or different ideas that are floating out there at the time. But again, social Darwinism was just the idea kind of to justify this growing gap between the wealthy and the poor. Carnegie would say that that gap is not a good thing, and you need to, as a rich person, do something about that. You need to give back. And the social gospel is calling on any Christian. The Christian thing to do is to help. Any Christian is supposed to help with that gap or with problems in the society. So those are all different kind of social ideas at the time, all kind of linked to these big businesses that are developing, and people either call them robber barons or captain of industry, depending on your position. So let's take a little look at what it was like to be a common person. We know that the people were on the top had lots and lots of money, but what about the people on the bottom? What was it like to be a typical worker? Well, first of all, you're going to work oftentimes in dangerous conditions. You're going to have machines that don't have safety features. They're going to be loud machines that destroy your hearing over time. The machines often put dust and other particles in the air that you breathe that shorten your life. They don't have to make things safe at this time because there's no government rules forcing them to. And if I put in better lighting, if I put in heat to make it warmer, if I put in safety features, that all costs me money as a businessman. That's all profit out of my pocket, and I don't want to do that. The best example I can give you of this is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that took place in New York City. Now, this is a sweatshop that created clothes. And it had mostly young girls, some as young as 13 and 14, but the typical age would be like 17, 18, 19, young girls that were working there making these clothes 10, 12 hours a day. And because they didn't trust their employees very much, they often locked them in their room to work so that they couldn't skip out and have a unauthorized break or go to the bathroom too long. Everything was done on a kind of regimented schedule. Well, what happens is a fire breaks out and the doors are chained and the workers can't get out. And so over 100 of these young girls die, many of them choosing to jump to their deaths because this was on like the 9th floor of one of the buildings in New York City. Many of them, instead of being burnt to death, decided to jump. Well, this created such a horrible backlash of the public that the government then started to pass laws to protect workers, which is why it's kind of important to know historically. But this was probably the best example that shows how dangerous work could be. We'll read about more. We'll read about the jungle, for example, and what work was like there and how dangerous it could be. But working conditions were not very good, often dangerous. There's going to be huge competition for jobs or among workers, primarily because of immigrants. Immigrants are coming thousands every day into the big cities, and they're looking for jobs, and they're willing to work for low wages. And so wages are going to be very low at this time, because if you don't want that job, there are hundreds of people that can replace you in a heartbeat. And so the competition for jobs is fierce. You're often going to have a hard time finding a job. But if you do have one, you're not going to be treated very well. You're going to be treated more as a number rather than a name, because if you can't work for me or don't want to work for me, I can easily replace you. You're almost like a spare part in my machine of my factory. I can quickly throw you away if you become defective. So this helps kind of, again, to change what was going on before, where employers and employees had kind of a close relationship as they often worked together. After the Civil War, then, as businesses continue to get bigger and bigger, that distance between worker and owner becomes more prevalent, and that's going to lead to some conflicts later on. There's also a lot of racism at the job place. The three main groups that are targeted are blacks, Chinese, and Irish. Blacks are often considered to be last hired, first fired material. They do the jobs that no one else will do. If you can't get anyone to work, you hire an African American. Chinese are going to be considered just one small step up from them. They are going to be particularly frowned upon of all the non-African American groups, so much so that they started to pass laws to keep them out of the country, because so many were coming in and what they thought was destroying our country because they were inferior people and so different from us. Irish also were a main target. They were negatively stereotyped, but the biggest problem they had is they were Catholics, many of them, and Catholics were often frowned upon as well. So racism was a part of your job place as well. Those were the three groups that were often targeted for that. Your job is going to be very boring and dull. You're going to be doing the same thing over and over and over again. It's very monotonous. You've probably been in some classes like that. Perhaps AP is like that for you. But remember the movie we saw, Far and Away, where the young lady earns her daily wage by plucking feathers off chickens. Well, imagine if that's all you ever did in your job, 10 hours every day, you just pluck chickens. That would get very dull and boring after a while. And often, sometimes that led to insanity in people, because you just kind of became Looney Tuning, because you worked this hard physical job just doing the same thing day after day after day, and people often broke down and couldn't take it anymore. And the last characteristic would be the extreme regimentation, which is hard for many Americans to take because we believe in freedom so much. But every part of your day was pretty much regimented. When you got up, when you ate, when you went to the bathroom, when you went home, when you went to bed, all of it was kind of run by your company or the factory that you worked at. You'd have very, very little freedom, or very, very few changes to your daily lifestyle or life schedule. And that was particularly true if you lived in something what was called a company town. A company town is a town, just like it says, where everything is owned by the company. The company owns the stores, the company owns the places where you live. Even the churches were run by the company. They would pick the preachers, and the preachers would be instructed to make sure you stress things that are good for our company, like loyalty and the idea that there's supposed to be people on the bottom, and so on and so forth. These company towns were very much regimented, and they basically used them to kind of keep the workers in line, and to keep them how they wanted them, and to keep them from unionizing and causing any trouble. And they also used them to get a lot of money back from them, because if I'm paying you a wage, but then you give it back to me in rent, the money really never leaves my hand. So that was kind of what it was like to be a typical worker of the time. I think you would agree with me, not the best time to be a common blue-collar worker where you're doing an everyday job. So because of that, these problems led to some of the first permanent unions or big-time unions. Now, we've seen unions touched on a little bit. And again, if you're taking the AP test, the union history, or how unions came to be, or the impact of unions, are a pretty big topic that they like to cover. So you want to pay attention to this. But some of the unions that formed during the Gilded Age are this. The Knights of Labor is one of the first big ones. This one is different from the unions that we studied before, because it includes all workers. Okay? Doesn't mean if you're skilled or unskilled, black, white, Chinese, Asian, doesn't matter. They tried to unite all workers together. Okay? Whether you're a skilled worker or you're just someone that digs a ditch, all of us are in it together against kind of the owners who have all this money. We don't. And as you can see here, they also work for non-violent means. These people tried to change the whole system. They wanted owners to see workers as a valuable commodity, and get it more to what it was like before, where the workers had some say in what was produced, how it was produced, and wages and things like that. So that's the Knights of Labor. They became very popular for a while, but what happens to them is they get linked to some negative things, some violent things, and that kind of destroys their credibility. We'll touch on that a little bit more. Then you have the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies, they were sometimes nicknamed. These are going to unite all workers as well. But these people want to use violence if necessary. These people were not above starting fights, taking certain people out, these kind of things. These were more violent people. We have to change the system in any way we can. So this was a more radical group, and this was a pretty big group as well. And that's the main thing, is you just need to know kind of what's the difference between these two groups. They're both popular at the time, but the Wobblies are definitely a more violent group. They're not afraid to mix it up and try to fight things physically, or try to change things through violence. Okay? The American Federation of Labor, often called the AFL, this was also gained popularity towards the end. This, as you can see, is only skilled. This is more exclusive. Only white males are allowed in this one. So these are some of the first unions. Again, the most important thing is to notice the difference between them, what separates them apart. Okay? Now, these unions are not going to be very favorably looked upon by the owners. They don't like them because, again, unions take away money, profits, because the unions want safer conditions, they want less hours, they want more pay, these kinds of things. All of that is going to lead to conflicts with owners. Okay? And here's another important tip. This often led to actual physical violence between the two groups. At this time, you could actually get a job as a strike breaker. If there was a strike or a work stoppage, you could be hired to go in and beat the people up that are on strike, to try to intimidate them to go back to work. Or violence often occurred because owners would say, okay, you want to strike? You're all fired. I'm going to hire in a bunch of new people called scabs. And then fights would break out between these new workers and the guys that are on the picket lines, because they don't want them stealing their jobs. And they realize that the only power they have is the factory being shut down. As long as the factory shut down, the owner's not making products and not making money. So if he can hire new workers to replace us, our strike's not going to go anywhere and we're going to be out of a job. And so violence was very, very common. And here's some of the more famous examples of this violence. We have the Haymarket riot that took place in Chicago. I referenced that a little bit earlier. The Knights of Labor are going to get blamed for that. What ends up happening is somebody throws a bomb into the Haymarket Square, which is a big open area or square in Chicago, and that kills some people, and including a policeman, and the policeman then open fire to kind of restore order, and they kill people on the other side. And that's probably one of the biggest or most famous examples of violence that took place between owners and workers at this time. You also have the Great Uprising of 1877, which many people just went on strike because they were unhappy with the railroads and the big corporations, the guys that they felt had all the money and were billionaires, and yet were treating the common people like garbage. And so the Great Uprising of 1877 is just a lot of people just didn't show up for work. They just decided to go on strike to try to bring the railroads and the big corporations to their knees, to try to get some concessions out of them, to get better pay and so forth. And then you also have the Homestead strike and the Pullman strike, which are a little bit later on, closer to the 1900s. Same type of thing. These are people that are striking particularly against the railroad at this time, because the railroad was extremely powerful and one of the biggest movers and shakers in all of the country. They had a lot to do with it. We talked about earlier how important the railroad was to the Second Industrial Revolution, so that gave them a lot of power, and because of that they really had some of the biggest abuses as well. And so these strikes were directed at them. But all you really need to know is this. You don't necessarily need to know the particulars. Just know these three things are really good examples of the conflict between owners and management that existed during the Gilded Age at this time in our history. So there's a lot of turmoil in the labor market because the workers are not treated very well, and when they try to resist by forming unions, the owners often then fight back as well. And this last point is important to remember about the topic as well, is that the government often sided with the owners. because they said the owners are the ones that are making the country go. They are the ones that are making our economy go. They're making us wealthy and powerful nation. And so the government often sided with them, often sending in troops, either the National Guard militia or actual federal troops, to help put down some of these strikes. And so remember that the government often sides with the owners on these different things, actually sending in troops, whether that be police, National Guard troops, or actual military troops. That's an important point to remember as well. So that kind of ends part 2 of Unit 9. We're talking about, again, labor and some of the first formations of unions. Just kind of remember the differences between the unions, and that this led to some pretty significant violence in our country at the time, where hundreds of people were killed because they were fighting these big government and things like that. So that ends part 2.